At graduation, my parents gave my sister $250,000 for a startup, and I got a $5 pamphlet. I gave it back with my $5 million bank balance inside. Their faces immediately drained of color. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life? Not the scary kind that haunts old houses, but the sad, quiet kind that no one even bothers to look at. The kind of ghosts that can stand in the middle of a crowded room, screaming at the top of their lungs, and nobody even blinks. That was me. That was my entire existence up until the day I turned 22. I stood there in my cheap polyester graduation gown, the fabric clinging to my back in the sweltering May heat. The air was thick, smelling of sweat, overly sweet perfume, and the overwhelming scent of other people's happiness. All around me, the campus lawn was a chaotic sea of celebrations. Fathers were hoisting their sons onto their shoulders. Mothers were crying, wiping mascara from their cheeks as they aggressively hugged their daughters. Grandparents were snapping pictures with digital cameras they barely knew how to operate. The noise was deafening, a chorus of laughter, cheers, and the constant hum of proud families. And then there was me, Morgan. Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, graduating summa cum laude from one of the most prestigious technical institutes in the country. And I was completely, utterly alone. I looked toward the rows of white folding chairs set up on the grass. I knew exactly where row G, seats 12 and 13 were. I had reserved them months ago. They were empty. The white plastic gleamed under the midday sun, mocking me. There was no mother waving a bouquet of grocery store flowers. No father holding up a cardboard sign with my name on it. Just two empty chairs in a sea of occupied ones. I reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked in the top left corner, a spiderweb of shattered glass over the display. I unlocked it. Still nothing new. Just the same text message I had received 3 hours ago from my mother. I didn't need to read it again, but my eyes scanned the words anyway, like a tongue pressing against an aching tooth just to make sure it still hurt. The text read, "We are so incredibly proud of our beautiful Valerie today. Her business degree is going to change the world. Cannot wait to celebrate when we get back. Make sure you feed the dog Morgan." That was it. Not a single word about my graduation. Not even an afterthought. Just a reminder to feed the golden retriever, paired with a glowing review of my twin sister. They were currently 3 states away, sitting in the front row of Valerie's graduation ceremony at a mid-tier state university, probably crying tears of joy. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who expected to be comforted. I had learned a long time ago that my tears were just invisible water falling on deaf ears. Instead, I took a deep breath of the hot, sticky air, turned my back on the empty chairs, and started walking toward the train station. The rhythmic clanking of my heavy boots on the pavement was the only applause I needed. I was taking the train back to Albany, New York. Back to the place they called home, even though it had never felt like one to me. I boarded the train, found an empty window seat, and watched the vibrant, happy campus blur into the distance. The rhythmic swaying of the train car felt like a metronome ticking away the last few hours of my tolerance. I did not know it then, but their absence today was just the warm-up act. The real humiliation was waiting for me at home. To understand the absolute insanity of my family dynamic, you have to understand the architecture of favoritism. It doesn't happen overnight. It's built brick by brick, year after year, until it becomes a fortress that completely blocks out the sun for the kid left on the outside. Valerie and I were born 12 minutes apart, but we might as well have been born on different planets. In the twisted psychology of my parents' minds, Valerie was the golden child, and I was the scapegoat. It's a classic textbook dynamic. Valerie had my mother's thick, perfect blonde curls and my father's striking blue eyes. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been brought to life, just to be displayed in a pageant. She was loud, she was needy, and she had this uncanny, terrifying ability to manipulate adult emotions before she could even tie her own shoes. I, on the other hand, was a genetic anomaly. I had stick-straight, dark brown hair and dull hazel eyes that shifted from brown to a muddy green depending on the light. I was quiet. I observed. I didn't throw tantrums because I realized early on that nobody came to soothe me when I did. They say parents don't have favorites. That is the biggest lie ever sold to society. My parents did not just favor Valerie, they worshipped her. Valerie operated on a strategy one later learned was called triangulation. If she broke a vase in the living room, she wouldn't hide it. She would wait until I walked into the room, then she would start sobbing hysterically, pointing her little finger at me when my mother rushed in. My mother wouldn't ask questions. She would just scoop Valerie up, kissing her blonde head, while glaring at me with a look of pure disgust. "Why are you so clumsy, Morgan? Look how much you scared your sister." It was a brilliant, evil little system. Valerie got the comfort and the center stage, my mother got to play the heroic savior, and I got to absorb all the blame and anger. I remember a specific family vacation to Florida when we were 10 years old. My parents had saved up for a year to take us to a massive theme park. I had spent weeks reading the maps, memorizing the rides I wanted to go on. On the morning we were supposed to go, Valerie woke up and decided she didn't want to walk in the heat. She claimed her stomach hurt and that looking at me made her feel anxious. Do you know what my parents did? They left me in the hotel room. A 10-year-old kid, sitting alone in a cheap motel room with a bucket of ice and a basic cable television, while they took my sister to the happiest place on earth. When they came back 12 hours later, sunburned and carrying bags of souvenirs, my mother just tossed me a melted chocolate bar and told me to be quiet because Valerie was tired. That was the day I stopped expecting anything. I started building a fortress of my own. A mental one. I discovered Stoicism long before I knew the philosophical term for it. I realized that I could not control their actions, their cruelty, or their blindness. But I could control my reaction. I learned to detach. When my mother would criticize my clothes, I would just stare at her forehead until she got uncomfortable and walked away. When my father would brag about Valerie's average grades while ignoring my straight A's, I would retreat into my mind, cataloging facts, numbers, and systems. I realized that human beings were flawed, emotional, and deeply unfair. But logic? Logic was pure. The real defining moment, the one that set the trajectory for the rest of my life, happened on our 16th birthday. In middle-class American suburbia, the 16th birthday is a massive milestone. It's the day of freedom. I remember standing in the driveway on a crisp October morning. My father had his hands over Valerie's eyes, guiding her out the front door. My mother was standing by the garage, holding a video camera, practically vibrating with excitement. I was standing off to the side, wearing an oversized sweater, completely ignored as usual. "Open your eyes," my father yelled. Valerie screamed. It was a high-pitched, theatrical shriek. Sitting in the driveway, with a giant red plastic bow on the roof, was a car. It was a used sedan, but it was spotless, shiny, and completely hers. It cost $16,000. I knew the exact price because I had seen the dealership paperwork sitting on the kitchen counter the night before. Valerie jumped into my father's arms, crying her fake tears, swearing she was the luckiest girl in the world. After about 20 minutes of photo taking and engine revving, my mother finally turned to me. "Oh, Morgan. Almost forgot." She walked into the house and came back out holding a rectangular cardboard box. She handed it to me. There was no wrapping paper. There was no red bow. I looked down. It was a laptop. A chunky, heavy, dark gray plastic machine bought from a discount electronics store. I could still see the yellow clearance sticker peeling off the corner. $300. "We noticed you spend a lot of time in your room," my father said, not even looking at me as he polished the hood of Valerie's car with his sleeve. "Thought you could use it for homework or whatever." I didn't say a word. I just held the box. Later that night, when I went down to the kitchen to get a glass of water, I heard them whispering in the living room. "Did you have to buy her that computer?" my father complained. "We're going to need every penny for Valerie's car insurance. You know how high the premiums are for teenagers." "I had to get her something," my mother hissed back. "It was $300 on clearance. She'll survive. Besides, Valerie needs reliable transportation for her social life. Morgan doesn't even go anywhere. I stood in the dark kitchen, the cold linoleum against my bare feet. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I felt absolute, crystal clear focus. They thought they had handed me a piece of cheap plastic to keep me quiet. They thought it was a consolation prize for the loser of the family. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to my empire. I took that heavy, ugly laptop up to my room, plugged it in, and opened it. The screen flickered to life. I didn't use it to play games or chat with friends. I used it to learn. I found free coding tutorials online. I learned Python. I learned C++. I learned how networks communicated, how firewalls were built, and how data was encrypted. I realized that inside this machine, I was God. I could build entire worlds, structure complex systems, and dictate the rules of reality. Machines didn't care if you had brown hair or blonde curls. They didn't care if you were the golden child. They only cared if your code was clean and your logic was sound. That $300 clearance laptop became my escape hatch. The illusion of my parents' control finally cracked during my senior year of high school. We were sitting at the dinner table. It was one of the rare nights Valerie was actually home and not out pretending to be a socialite at the local mall. My father cleared his throat, tapping his fork against his plate to demand attention. "Girls, we need to have a serious talk about college," he said, using his deep, authoritative voice that he reserved for major family announcements. My mother reached over and patted Valerie's hand affectionately. "We've been looking at the finances," she added, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "And we've made a decision. We have a college fund, but with the economy being what it is, it's not enough for both of you to go to a 4-year university." I kept chewing my dry chicken breast, my eyes fixed on my plate. I knew exactly where this was going. Valerie's business program at the state university is very competitive, and she needs the campus experience to build her network, my father continued, looking everywhere except at me. "So, we've decided to use the college fund for Valerie. Morgan, we think it would be best if you looked into the local community college. You can live at home, work part-time, and maybe transfer in a few years." They waited for the explosion. They wanted me to cry, to beg, to yell about how unfair it was. They fed on that kind of drama because it validated their power. Instead, I swallowed my food, wiped my mouth with a napkin, and looked directly into my father's eyes. "That won't be necessary," I said calmly. "Morgan, don't be difficult," my mother sighed, rolling her eyes. "This is just the reality of our financial situation." "I'm not being difficult," I replied, keeping my voice entirely flat. "I'm telling you it won't be necessary because I don't need your money. I was accepted into MIT. Early decision. Full-ride academic scholarship. Tuition, housing, and a stipend for books are completely covered. Mr. Gallagher, my coding teacher, helped me submit my portfolio 3 months ago." The silence in the dining room was absolute. It was thick and heavy, like wet concrete. Valerie's jaw literally dropped. My mother's hand froze midair. My father stared at me as if I had just started speaking fluent Russian. They weren't proud. If you think they jumped up and hugged me, you're dead wrong. They were offended. They were furious that I had successfully navigated a massive life achievement completely outside of their control. I had broken their narrative. I wasn't the helpless scapegoat anymore. I was an independent entity moving out of their blast radius. "MIT," my father finally choked out. "How? When did you even apply?" "While you were busy buying Valerie her prom dress," I said, pushing my chair back. "Excuse me. I have homework." Leaving for Cambridge, Massachusetts was like taking my first real breath of oxygen. MIT was brutally hard, demanding, and utterly exhausting. I loved every second of it. I was surrounded by people who spoke my language, the language of logic, systems, and relentless work ethic. My calls home were infrequent and excruciating. Whenever I called, my mother would pick up, and within 10 seconds, the conversation would be entirely about my sister. "Oh, Morgan, you won't believe it," she would gush through the phone, ignoring my greeting. "Valerie went to a mixer at the dean's house last night. She wore this stunning blue dress. She's rubbing elbows with the heirs to the Johnson pharmaceutical fortune. She's building such a high-end network. Her lifestyle consulting business is going to be massive. I would just hold the phone away from my ear, staring at my computer screen filled with complex terminal commands. "That's great, Mom. What about you?" she would ask, clearly bored. "Still just typing on the computer in your dorm?" "Yeah, Mom. Just typing." I never told her the truth. I never told her that while Valerie was drinking cheap wine and pretending to be rich on our parents' dime, I was building a digital fortress. It happened during my sophomore year. I was sitting in the back of an advanced cryptography seminar when I noticed a guy 2 rows down obsessively tapping a pencil against his notebook, staring at the exact same flaw in the professor's theoretical algorithm that I had spotted. His name was Victor. He was as socially awkward as I was, wore the same 3 hoodies on rotation, and had an intellect that was terrifyingly sharp. We didn't become friends in the traditional sense. We became partners in an obsession. For 3 years, Victor and I lived a shadow existence. We skipped parties, we barely slept, and our diet consisted entirely of instant ramen noodles, cheap black coffee, and stale vending machine crackers. We were building something massive. It wasn't a cute little social media app or a mobile game. We were engineering a proprietary data encryption protocol, a core security architecture designed to make cloud databases virtually impenetrable to external brute force attacks. I poured every ounce of my childhood trauma into that code. The encryption layers I built were a direct reflection of the emotional walls I had built against my family. I designed a system that was paranoid, defensive, and ruthlessly efficient at shutting down unauthorized access. If I couldn't protect my younger self from my mother's psychological warfare, I was damn sure going to protect corporate data packets from Russian hackers. By the middle of our senior year, the protocol was flawless. We filed the patents quietly. Then, Victor used a connection from one of our professors to get us a meeting with a massive corporate acquisitions firm in Silicon Valley. I won't bore you with the technical jargon or the endless, exhausting legal meetings that took place over Zoom in the dead of night. What you need to know is this: the sharks smelled blood. They saw a piece of technology built by 2 college kids that could save enterprise tech companies billions of dollars in data breach liabilities. They tried to lowball us. They tried to bully us. But they didn't know they were dealing with someone who had survived 20 years of psychological manipulation from a masterclass narcissist. When their hotshot lawyers tried to pressure me, trying to make me feel small and inexperienced, I just stared at them with the exact same dead-eyed, stoic expression I used when my mother criticized my weight. I didn't blink. I didn't fold. I countered their offers with ruthless, mathematical precision. 6 months later, the ink was dry on the contract. They bought the protocol, the patents, and the source code outright. I will never forget the Tuesday afternoon the wire transfer cleared. I was sitting alone in my cramped, dingy dorm room. The radiator was clinking loudly, smelling of dust and hot metal. I was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt with a hole near the left cuff. I opened the banking app on my phone. The screen loaded, a little spinning circle mocking my anxiety. And then, there it was. Available balance, $5,012,430. $5 million. My cut of the buyout, after all federal and state taxes had been brutally extracted. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. I refreshed the app. The number didn't change. I logged out and logged back in. Still there. I was 22 years old, and I possessed more liquid capital than my parents and their entire bloodline had ever seen in their lives. A normal person would have screamed. A normal person would have immediately picked up the phone, called their parents, and shouted, "I'm rich." I did it. But I am not a normal person. As my thumb hovered over my mother's contact name in my phone, a dark, cold realization washed over me. I asked myself a very simple question. Would you tell a family of emotional vampires that you just won the lottery? If I told them, the narrative would instantly shift. My mother wouldn't apologize for 20 years of neglect. She would instantly claim credit for my success. Oh, we always knew Morgan was a genius. That $300 laptop we sacrificed to buy her really paid off. Valerie would immediately pivot from ignoring my existence to calling me her soulmate sister, slipping a knife of guilt into my ribs about how family has to share their blessings. They would bleed me dry, not just financially, but emotionally. They would finally love me, but only because my net worth had enough zeros attached to it. I decided right then and there to keep my mouth shut. I engaged in the ultimate psychological test. I wanted to see exactly how they would treat me when they thought I was still just the poor, invisible computer nerd who would inevitably end up working in a cubicle. I didn't buy a sports car. I didn't buy a Rolex. I continued to eat cheap noodles. I kept wearing my thrift store clothes. I wanted to walk into the lion's den one last time, wearing the scent of a peasant, just to see how sharp their teeth still were. I was going to attend the joint graduation party my parents were throwing back home. The party that was supposedly for both of us, but I knew the truth. I packed my battered canvas duffel bag, made sure my cheap phone was charged, and prepared to step back into the shadow empire of my family. I had $5 million resting quietly in the cloud, and I was about to watch them humiliate themselves. If you are enjoying this story so far, please take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with the name of the city you are living in. Every comment helps the video reach more people who might be dealing with their own toxic families. Thank you so much for your support. The train ride back to Albany was a masterclass in mental preparation. I sat by the window, watching the industrial outskirts of Massachusetts give way to the green, rolling hills of upstate New York. Every mile that brought me closer to my childhood home felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. But I was ready. I had built my armor out of logic, and I had $5 million quietly sitting in a high-yield account to serve as my shield. When my taxi finally pulled up to the driveway of my parents' house, I actually let out a dry, humorless laugh. It was worse than I had imagined. The front lawn was practically screaming. They had staked massive, glittering yard signs into the grass that spelled out "Congratulations, Valerie" in giant gold letters. A professionally printed vinyl banner was draped across the garage door, featuring a blown-up, heavily edited portrait of my sister holding her business degree, with the words "Future CEO" printed underneath. There was absolutely no mention of me. None. If a stranger walked past this house, they would assume my parents only had one child. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just observing the sheer scale of the delusion. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was a shrine. This was a monument built to worship their own reflection, projected onto my sister. I grabbed my heavy canvas duffel bag and walked up the front steps. I didn't bother knocking. I just turned the knob and pushed the door open. The house was chaotic. The scent of catered garlic shrimp and expensive floral arrangements hit me instantly. Family friends, distant relatives, and neighbors were milling around the living room, holding plastic cups of champagne. "Hello," I called out, my voice cutting through the chatter. My mother was standing near the dining table, wearing a brand new cocktail dress, frantically arranging a platter of tiny, overpriced appetizers. She snapped her head toward me. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine annoyance flash across her eyes, annoyance that I had showed up and interrupted her perfect stage production. She quickly masked it with a tight, stressed smile. "Morgan, you are finally here," she said, not walking over to greet me, not offering a hug, and certainly not saying congratulations. "Put your bag in the hallway. I am incredibly behind schedule. The caterers messed up the napkin colors. Can you please go into the kitchen and start folding the white napkins into triangles? Valerie's VIP guests are going to be here any minute." I just stared at her. I had just graduated from one of the most elite technical institutes on the planet, and her first instinct was to treat me like unpaid event staff at my sister's coronation. "Sure, Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I will get right on that." I walked into the kitchen, dropping my bag by the refrigerator. I stood by the counter, slowly folding a paper napkin, observing the madness from afar. That was when Aunt Clara walked in. Aunt Clara was my father's older sister, and she was the only person in this entire bloodline who possessed a functioning moral compass. She took one look at me, looked at the napkin in my hand, and then looked out into the living room at the massive shrine to Valerie. Her face hardened. She walked straight up to me and wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a tight, genuine hug. "Congratulations, Morgan," she whispered fiercely into my ear. "I am so incredibly proud of you. Graduating from MIT is a massive achievement. Do not let them dim your light today." "Thanks, Aunt Clara," I replied, pulling back and giving her a small, knowing smile. "Don't worry. They can't dim anything. I am just here to watch the show." Aunt Clara frowned, confused by my calmness, but before she could ask what I meant, a loud clinking of glass echoed from the dining room. My father was striking a butter knife against his champagne flute. The main event was about to begin. The financial slaughter I was about to witness was going to be legendary. The crowd gathered around the massive oak dining table. I stood in the back, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen, completely invisible in my faded gray sweater, while Valerie held court at the head of the table. She was wearing a designer white dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, looking at our father with wide, adoring eyes. "Family and friends, if I could have your attention," my father boomed, his chest puffed out with a level of pride I had never once seen directed at me. "Today, we are gathered to celebrate absolute brilliance. We are here to celebrate our beautiful daughter, Valerie." He paused, letting the room erupt into polite applause. Not a single eye flickered in my direction. "Valerie has always had a vision," he continued, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "She understands people. She understands the world of business. And she has decided to launch her own luxury lifestyle consulting agency right here in the city. But, as we all know, a brilliant mind needs capital to build an empire." My mother stepped forward, wiping a single, perfect tear from her cheek. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. I watched this unfold with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a deeply flawed experiment. I knew my parents' financial situation. I knew my father was a mid-level regional manager and my mother worked part-time at a real estate office. They lived a comfortable middle-class life, but they were not wealthy. They had a mortgage. They had car payments. "Your mother and I believe in you so much, sweetheart," my father said, handing the envelope to Valerie. "We wanted to make sure you had the runway to launch your brand without worrying about investors or terrible bank loans. So, we went to the bank. We took out a home equity line of credit on this house, and we cashed out the majority of my retirement fund." A collective gasp swept through the room. Even the neighbors looked slightly uncomfortable. Valerie tore open the envelope with the speed of a starving animal. She pulled out a cashier's check. Her eyes widened, and she let out an ear-splitting scream. $250,000. Valerie shrieked, jumping out of her chair and throwing her arms around our father's neck. "Oh my God. You guys are the best parents in the entire world. I am going to be so rich. I promise I am going to buy you guys a mansion when my company goes public." It was nauseating. It was a masterclass in financial suicide. $250,000. They had literally mortgaged their shelter and set fire to their old age security to hand $250,000 to a 22-year-old girl who thought lifestyle consulting was a real corporate sector. They were funding her Instagram delusion with their literal survival money. I looked at Aunt Clara. She was pale, her hand covering her mouth in absolute horror. She knew exactly how insane this was. To Valerie, my father yelled, raising his glass. "The future CEO." To Valerie, the room echoed. I didn't raise a glass. I just watched my mother crying tears of joy, completely blinded to the fact that she had just signed her own financial death warrant. I felt a strange, cold sense of pity for them. They were so desperate to be associated with Valerie's fake glamour that they had happily walked into a trap. But the show wasn't over. My father suddenly turned his head, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me standing in the shadows of the doorway. The room fell silent. He cleared his throat, suddenly looking awkward, as if he had just remembered he owned a second dog that needed feeding. "And, of course, we also want to acknowledge Morgan," he said, the enthusiasm completely draining from his voice, replaced by a flat, obligatory tone. "Morgan also finished her computer classes today." Computer classes. That was what he called a degree in computer science from MIT. He reached under the table and pulled out a small, incredibly thin package wrapped in brown shipping paper. He didn't walk over to hand it to me. He just slid it across the long dining table. It stopped near the edge. I pushed off the door frame and slowly walked toward the table. The silence was deafening. Every eye was on me now, contrasting the extravagant display of wealth they had just witnessed with the pathetic little rectangle sitting in front of me. I was about to receive my reward for 4 years of grueling, brilliant work. I stood at the table and looked down at the brown paper. I didn't rush. I didn't show an ounce of emotion. I slowly peeled the cheap tape back and let the paper fall away. Lying on the table was a book. Actually, calling it a book is an insult to literature. It was a flimsy, glossy pamphlet, the kind you find spinning on a wire rack near the register at a highway gas station. The title, printed in loud, obnoxious yellow letters, read, "Steps to Wealth, Budgeting for Beginners." It was so thin you could probably read it in 12 minutes. And the best part? The ultimate cherry on top of this humiliating sundae? They hadn't even bothered to peel the price sticker off the back cover. A bright neon orange circle screamed, $5. Clearance. A heavy, awkward silence descended upon the dining room. You could hear a pin drop. The contrast was so brutally violent it was almost comical. $250,000 for the golden child to play pretend. A $5 gas station pamphlet for the scapegoat who had actually secured a future. Valerie was the first to break the silence. She let out a sharp, condescending snort, quickly covering her mouth with her hand to pretend she was coughing. "Well," Valerie said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy as she looked at me. "It's a good start, Morgan. You know, since you'll probably be doing entry-level tech support for a few years. You really need to learn how to stretch a dollar. But hey, once my agency takes off, maybe I can hire you to fix my office printers. I'll even give you a family discount on my consulting services." A few of her friends chuckled. My mother beamed at Valerie, proud of her generosity. "We thought it was practical," my father added defensively, crossing his arms. "You've always been frugal, Morgan. We thought you would appreciate the financial advice." I stood there, looking down at the neon orange $5 sticker. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm in my chest. I felt the collective pity of the room washing over me. They expected me to break. They expected me to burst into tears, to scream about the unfairness, to storm out of the house. That was the reaction a normal person would have. That was the reaction that would give them power, because it would prove that their actions could still hurt me. But I had built a fortress of absolute ice. I looked up from the pamphlet and made direct eye contact with my father. Then I looked at my mother. Finally, I looked at Valerie. I didn't frown. I didn't glare. I gave them a calm, perfectly pleasant smile. The kind of smile you give a customer service representative when they tell you your flight is delayed. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of sarcasm. "I appreciate the thought. I am sure this will be incredibly educational." I picked up the pamphlet, nodded politely to the room, and turned around. I walked up the stairs with perfectly measured steps, ignoring the confused whispers that erupted behind my back. My stoicism had unnerved them. They had swung their heaviest emotional bat, and they had hit solid concrete. I walked into my childhood bedroom and closed the door, locking it behind me. The room was exactly as I had left it 4 years ago, bare, sterile, and cold. I sat down on the edge of the twin bed and let out a long, slow exhale. The game was over. They had played their final hand. Now it was my turn to flip the board. I opened my canvas bag and pulled out my laptop. I connected to the house Wi-Fi, opened a secure browser, and logged into my offshore banking portal. The screen illuminated my dark room with a cool, blue light. I navigated to the main dashboard. Available balance, $5,012,430. I didn't feel joy looking at that number. I felt a terrifying, surgical precision. I connected my laptop to the wireless printer my father kept in his home office down the hall. I hit print. I heard the machine whir to life through the walls. I quietly slipped out of my room, walked down the hall, and retrieved the single sheet of crisp white paper from the printer tray. I brought it back to my room. The numbers were printed clearly in black ink, undeniable and absolute. I took the $5 Steps to Wealth pamphlet. I opened it to the very center. I folded my bank statement in half and slipped it deep between the cheap, glossy pages. I closed the pamphlet and laid it gently on my pillow. Tomorrow morning, they were going to get a lesson in wealth they would never, ever forget. The next morning, the house smelled of stale champagne, expensive vanilla candles, and overwhelming arrogance. I woke up at 6 a.m., packed my few belongings back into my canvas duffel bag, and dressed in the same faded jeans and gray sweater I had worn the day before. I held the $5 pamphlet in my right hand, feeling the slight bulk of the folded bank statement hidden inside. I walked downstairs. The kitchen was already alive. My parents and Valerie were sitting around the kitchen island, drinking premium coffee. The $250,000 cashier's check was literally sitting on the marble counter, propped up against a fruit bowl like a holy relic. Valerie was mid-sentence, scrolling through her phone with a manic energy. And the commercial real estate agent said the loft space downtown is available, Valerie was gushing. It has exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, and it's right next to that high-end organic cafe. The rent is insane, but you have to spend money to make money, right? Clients need to walk in and smell success. I'm thinking of ordering custom Italian leather chairs for the reception area. My mother was nodding vigorously, completely entranced. Absolutely, honey. Image is everything in consulting. You have to project wealth before you can attract it. They were literally planning to burn through $250,000 of retirement funds on aesthetic furniture and high-rent brick walls for a business that didn't have a single client. It was a spectacular display of financial illiteracy. "Good morning," I said, stepping into the light of the kitchen, dropping my heavy duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a loud thud. The three of them stopped talking and looked at me. The warm, excited atmosphere instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, patronizing chill. "Oh, you're up early," my father said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He glanced at my bag. "Heading back to the dorms to pack up your stuff?" "I already packed," I said, walking over to the coffee pot and pouring myself a black cup. "I am leaving for good. I hired a car. It should be here in 20 minutes to take me to the train station." My mother sighed, shaking her head. "Morgan, you really need to learn how to plan. Where are you even going to live? You can't just wander around looking for an apartment. Have you even started looking for a job doing tech support?" "I have a job," I replied, leaning against the counter. "I signed a contract with a technology acquisitions firm 6 months ago. And I have a place to live. I'm moving back to Cambridge today." Valerie scoffed, swirling her coffee. "Cambridge? Morgan, do you have any idea how expensive the rent is in Cambridge? Let me guess. You're going to be crammed into a tiny 3-bedroom apartment with 6 other sweaty computer nerds, eating ramen noodles to survive. You should have stayed here. Mom and Dad would let you live in the basement for free." "I am not living with roommates," I said smoothly. "I am living alone." My father let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Alone? In Cambridge? With an entry-level coding salary? Morgan, please be realistic. You have no concept of how the real world works. You are going to bankrupt yourself in 3 months. You need to learn how to budget." He pointed a finger at the $5 pamphlet in my hand. "You need to sit down and read that book I gave you. Seriously. It might save you from getting evicted." I looked down at the cheap, glossy cover in my hand. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator that had finally backed its prey into a corner. "You know what, Dad?" I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming dead calm. "You are absolutely right. This book is incredibly educational. In fact, I found a specific piece of financial data inside it that I think is very relevant to this conversation." I took 2 steps forward and placed the pamphlet flat on the kitchen island, right next to Valerie's cashier's check. "I think you should take a look at it," I said softly. My father looked at the pamphlet, then looked at me, his brow furrowed in irritation. "What are you talking about, Morgan? It's a budgeting book. I bought it. I know what's in it. Just open it to the middle, Dad," I insisted, crossing my arms over my chest. He let out an exaggerated sigh, muttered something under his breath about my attitude, and reached out. He flipped the cheap pamphlet open. The folded piece of white printer paper was resting right between chapters 4 and 5. My father paused. He picked up the folded paper with 2 fingers, looking confused. He slowly unfolded it and laid it flat on the marble counter. I watched his eyes scan the top of the document. He saw the logo of a premier offshore, high-wealth management bank. Then his eyes moved down to the account holder name, Morgan Wells. Finally, his eyes dragged themselves down to the bold, black numbers at the bottom of the page under available balance. I have read about the human fight or flight response in biology textbooks. But seeing it happen in real time, watching the physical manifestation of absolute shock shut down a human nervous system, is a beautiful thing. My father stopped breathing. Literally. His chest froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he was going into cardiac arrest. The smug, condescending patriarch vanished, replaced by an old man staring into the abyss. His hands started to tremble, rattling his coffee cup against the saucer. What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of air. My mother, annoyed by his reaction, leaned over his shoulder. Valerie stood up on her tiptoes to peer across the island. "Let me see that," my mother snapped. She looked at the paper. She read the number. $5,012,430. My mother dropped her coffee mug. It hit the floor, shattering into dozens of pieces, hot brown liquid splashing against the pristine white cabinets. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, her mouth hanging open, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto a dock. $5 million? Valerie suddenly shrieked, the sound tearing through the kitchen like a siren. She lunged forward and snatched the paper from the counter, holding it inches from her face. "Is this a joke? Did you print this from a fake website, Morgan? You psycho, this is illegal." "It's not a joke," I said, my voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had all the power in the room. I looked at my father, who was still staring blankly at the empty space where the paper had been. "Remember my sophomore year?" I asked calmly. "Remember when I tried to tell you about the encryption protocol my partner and I were building? The one you told me to stop talking about because Valerie was trying to tell a story about her sorority formal? We sold the patent to a tech conglomerate in Silicon Valley 6 months ago. They paid us in cash. My cut, after taxes, was $5 million. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the coffee dripping off the cabinets onto the floor. I watched their brains completely short-circuit. They were trying to process an impossible reality. The daughter they had ignored, the scapegoat they had handed a $5 clearance book, was standing in their kitchen possessing 20 times the amount of money they had just ruined their lives to give to their golden child. I watched their expressions closely. I was waiting for the guilt. I was waiting for the crushing realization of how horribly they had treated me. I was waiting for them to apologize for missing my graduation, for giving me cheap garbage, for telling me I was going to be a failure. But the guilt never came. Instead, I watched a horrifying transformation. I watched the shock melt away from Valerie's face, replaced by a dark, calculating glint in her eyes. The predator had smelled fresh blood. I watched my mother's terrified expression suddenly shift into a sickeningly sweet, desperate mask. They didn't regret abusing me. They only regretted that they hadn't realized I was a walking bank vault. "Morgan, oh my God," my mother gasped, her hands flying to her chest. She stepped forward, ignoring the broken glass on the floor, and reached out to grab my arm. Her grip was frantic, clawing at my sweater. "Morgan, sweetie," she breathed, her eyes wide and manic. "Sweetie, this is incredible. Why didn't you tell us? We are so proud of you. We have always known you were a genius. We always knew you were destined for greatness." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I felt physically sick. The word sweetie sounded utterly foreign coming from a woman who had spent 22 years acting like I was a stain on her rug. I gently, but firmly, grabbed her wrist and removed her hand from my arm. I took a step back. "Are you proud of me, Mom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, sharp as broken glass. "Or are you proud of my bank account?" My mother recoiled as if I had slapped her. "Morgan, how can you say that? You're my daughter. We are family." Family, I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the word. I looked over at my father. He was staring at the $250,000 check on the counter, then looking at my $5 million bank statement in Valerie's hand. I could practically see the gears grinding in his head, doing the brutal math of his ruined retirement. Valerie suddenly stepped around the island. The condescending, arrogant CEO persona was entirely gone. She looked panicked, desperate, and incredibly dangerous. "Morgan, listen," Valerie said, forcing a warm, sisterly smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is amazing news. This changes everything. You know, Mom and Dad took on a lot of terrible debt to help me start my business. They remortgaged the house. If you have $5 million, I mean, you could pay off their loan right now. You could clear their debt and barely even feel it. We could go into business together. With my vision and your capital, we could rule the world." I stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She wanted my money to cover her vanity project, to save the parents who had willingly sacrificed themselves for her. "Your loan is your problem, Valerie," I said coldly. "Dad said it himself. A brilliant mind needs capital to build an empire. You got your capital. I got a $5 pamphlet." "Morgan, please," my father suddenly barked, his voice laced with panic. "We are talking about our house. We are talking about my retirement. You have millions. You can't just walk away and let your family struggle. You didn't struggle when you left me in a cheap motel room in Florida while you took her to a theme park," I replied, my voice steady, pulling up memories from the deep archives. "You didn't struggle when you bought her a $16,000 car and threw a cheap laptop at me. You didn't struggle when you skipped my graduation at MIT to celebrate a business degree that has produced zero revenue." A loud honk echoed from the street outside. My hired car had arrived. I reached out, took the printed bank statement from Valerie's trembling hand, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my back pocket. "I am not a bank," I said, looking at the three of them one last time. "And you are not my family. You are just people I used to live with. Good luck with the lifestyle consulting." I grabbed the handle of my duffel bag, turned my back on them, and walked out the front door. "Morgan, wait. You can't do this." Valerie screamed from the hallway. "We are blood." I didn't turn around. I walked down the driveway, got into the back seat of the black sedan, and told the driver to take me to the station. As the car pulled away, I looked out the tinted window. My parents and Valerie were standing on the front porch, staring after me. They didn't look like a happy, superior family anymore. They looked like three desperate beggars watching a vault door slam shut forever. The journey back to Massachusetts felt entirely different. The oppressive weight that had rested on my chest for 2 decades was gone. I felt light. I felt invincible. I had walked into the belly of the beast, looked the monster in the eye, and starved it to death. When I arrived in Cambridge, I didn't go to a dingy dorm room or a cramped apartment with 6 roommates. I went straight to the downtown office of a luxury real estate broker. I sat in a leather chair, drank sparkling water, and signed the final paperwork. Then I authorized the wire transfer from my offshore account. I paid in cash outright for a 2-bedroom penthouse overlooking the Charles River. I took a cab to my new building, rode the private elevator up to the top floor, and unlocked the door. The apartment was empty, echoing, and flooded with natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was completely silent. It was my sanctuary. I walked into the massive living room, dropped my cheap duffel bag on the expensive hardwood floor, and finally pulled my phone out of my pocket. I had turned it on silent when I got into the taxi in Albany. The screen was a war zone. I had 64 missed calls. 42 were from my mother, 15 from my father, and 7 from Valerie. The text messages were a scrolling essay of emotional manipulation. My mother's texts went from begging, "Morgan, please answer, we love you. We are so sorry. Let's talk about this over dinner," to guilt-tripping, "How can you sleep at night knowing your father is crying? He might lose his house." Valerie's texts were even worse, completely unhinged. "You selfish, arrogant glitch. That money belongs to this family. You owe WS for raising you. Answer the phone before I call the police and say you stole it." I didn't reply to a single one. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a profound, clinical disgust. I opened my phone settings, selected my mother, my father, and my sister's contacts, and hit block. Then I threw the phone onto the kitchen counter, walked over to the massive window, and watched the sun set over the city that was now mine to conquer. The silence of the penthouse was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. 9 months passed. 9 months of absolute, uninterrupted peace. I started my job at the tech acquisitions firm, not because I needed the money, but because I loved the work. I furnished my penthouse. I bought myself a ridiculous, high-end espresso machine. I lived on my own terms. I kept my family blocked. The only tether I had to my past was Aunt Clara. She called me once a month to check in, and, through her, I received the dispatch reports from the war zone I had left behind. The collapse of the Golden Child was spectacular and mathematically inevitable. According to Aunt Clara, Valerie's luxury lifestyle consulting agency lasted exactly 6 months. She burned through the entire $250,000. She didn't spend it on marketing or client acquisition. She spent it on renting that exposed brick office, buying custom Italian furniture, leasing a luxury SUV under the company name, and throwing expensive networking parties where she just bought drinks for her unemployed friends. She never secured a single paying client. When the money ran out, she abandoned the lease and moved back into my parents' basement. The financial fallout for my parents was catastrophic. Without the retirement funds they had drained, and with the massive monthly payments looming on the home equity loan they took out for Valerie, they defaulted. One rainy Tuesday evening, while I was sitting on my velvet couch drinking tea, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number from upstate New York. I knew who it was. I accepted the call and put it on speaker. Morgan. The voice was frail, shattered, and weeping. It was my mother. Morgan, please don't hang up. Please. I sat in silence, looking out at the city lights. Speak, I said coldly. We are losing the house, Morgan, she sobbed, the desperation bleeding through the speaker. The bank sent the foreclosure notice yesterday. Your father had a minor heart attack from the stress. Valerie is depressed and won't leave the basement. We have nothing. We are going to be on the street. Please, Morgan. You are our daughter. You have millions. It would be pocket change for you to save our home. I am begging you. I am so sorry for everything. I am so sorry. I listened to the woman who had ignored my existence for 22 years, crying over the consequences of her own horrific choices. You aren't sorry for how you treated me, Mom, I said, my voice steady, echoing in the massive, empty penthouse. You are only sorry that the child you bet your life on turned out to be a fraud, and the child you threw away turned out to be your only lifeboat. But I am not a lifeboat. I am the iceberg. Morgan, please, I ended the call. I blocked the unknown number. I walked out onto my balcony, the cool wind hitting my face. They sacrificed my childhood and their own future to fund a golden child who lost everything in 6 months. Now, staring at foreclosure, they expect my $5 million to save them from their own toxic favoritism. I walked away without a word, leaving them to drown in the bed they made. But as I sit in my penthouse, looking out at the city, a small part of me wonders about the old couple losing their home. Am I wrong for letting them face the brutal consequences of their own actions? Should I ever open the door to accept their hollow apologies, or is family sometimes just a title used by parasites? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button and let me know your verdict in the comments below. Let me know what you would do if you were in my shoes.